Do you believe trauma runs in families like a pattern or breaks with you?
I remember that ordinary Tuesday afternoon in my modest kitchen in Dayton, Ohio, where the sunlight filtered through the half-drawn blinds, casting warm stripes across the linoleum floor that I'd scrubbed clean just the day before. As I balanced little Lily on my lap while carefully spooning another helping of those bright green mashed peas into her tiny mouth, watching her gums mash them up with that pure, unfiltered joy only a 1-year-old can muster amid the simple routines that had become my anchor in the storm of family obligations that never seemed to let up no matter how many times I tried to set boundaries. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner and Lily's occasional gurgles of delight. A peaceful bubble I'd carved out after years of juggling my accounting job at the local firm with the unexpected role of full-time auntie since my sister Tina's life had spiraled into one crisis after another, leaving me to pick up the pieces for this sweet girl who deserved so much better than the chaos her parents had dragged her into from the start. My phone sat on the counter nearby, charging innocently after a long morning of emails and spreadsheets, and when it buzzed with that familiar vibration that always signaled an incoming text, I reached for it absent-mindedly with one hand while studying the spoon with the other, assuming it was just a work update or maybe a reminder from daycare about pickup time. But as I glanced at the screen and saw Mom's name, Evelyn Jenkins, the perpetual whirlwind in our family who viewed financial responsibility as an optional suggestion rather than a necessity, the message that popped up hit me like a freight train barreling through the fragile calm I'd built around us. Off to Paris, honey, emptied the family account for the trip of a lifetime. Don't wait up, it read in her characteristically breezy tone, the kind she used to sugarcoat every impulsive decision that had ever landed us in hot water. And in that instant, everything inside me froze as the implications crashed over me like a wave, because that joint family account wasn't some endless piggy bank for her daydreams. It was the safety net I'd meticulously managed for years, holding the remnants of Dad's life insurance and my own overtime contributions specifically earmarked for Lily's medical bills, the ongoing treatments for her severe allergies, and those specialist visits that cost more than my monthly rent without blinking an eye. I set the spoon down carefully on the tray, my heart pounding in a rhythm that matched the rising tide of anger and disbelief, and looked straight into Lily's trusting eyes as she reached for the forgotten peas, whispering to her in a voice that aimed for steady, but carried an edge of that wry humor I developed as armor against this very kind of betrayal. Lucky I moved it yesterday, sweetheart, or we'd be staring at an empty bowl and a whole lot of nothing right now. Because indeed, I'd spotted the warning signs in Mom's recent chatter about needing a grand adventure to escape the drudgery of her empty nest in Cincinnati. Her vague hints at booking flights during our last phone call that prompted me to log into the bank app late the previous night and transfer every single dollar into my personal high-yield savings account. A quiet act of self-preservation born from too many instances of her borrowing that left Lily short on formula or me scraping by on ramen to cover the shortfall. Of course, she had no idea about my precaution, and as I wiped Lily's messy chin with a damp cloth, a small, almost guilty smile tugged at my lips at the thought of the chaos unfolding on her end. The kind of poetic justice that felt both vindicating and a touch wicked after decades of being the reliable one in a lineage of dreamers who treated consequences like suggestions written in pencil. Scooping Lily up onto my shoulder to soothe her budding fussiness from the interrupted meal, I paced the kitchen with her warm weight against me, dialing Mom's number before I could second-guess the confrontation that was inevitable. The line ringing twice in the quiet space before she answered with that forced cheerfulness she reserved for when she knew she'd overstepped but wasn't ready to admit it. Her voice echoing slightly as if she were already in some airport terminal surrounded by the bustle of travelers chasing their own escapes. Paris, Mom? That sounds like quite the splurge. How's the hotel deposit shaping up with the cards linked to the account? I asked, keeping my tone light and conversational, almost teasing, as if we were discussing weekend plans rather than the potential derailment of her fantasy getaway, and I could hear the brief silence on her end. The subtle shift from confidence to confusion as she presumably tried swiping or tapping somewhere amid the pre-flight frenzy, her response coming back hesitant at first, laced with that defensive edge she always deployed when caught. When the reality sank in and she realized the funds weren't there, her words tumbled out in a rush of accusations and pleas, calling me out for meddling in family business, and insisting this trip was her due after years of hardship since Dad's passing from that sudden heart attack 5 years back. But I countered steadily, reminding her of the specific purpose of that account, the doctor's co-pays stacking up for Lily's condition. The emergency fund I'd rebuilt 3 times over after her previous emergencies that conveniently never got repaid, and as the argument escalated into familiar territory of raised voices and recycled grievances, I felt a surge of empowerment unlike any before. Knowing my foresight had shielded us from immediate disaster while her plans crumbled in real time. To add that satisfying twist without escalating to outright cruelty, because even in revenge there's a line I try not to cross too recklessly, I suggested she check with the bank directly while I simultaneously pulled up the banking app on my phone and activated the freeze on all joint cards, a simple click that would bounce every attempt she made from here on out. Picturing her standing in line at some international counter with declining notifications lighting up her screen like fireworks gone wrong, and it was almost comical in its inevitability. The way her big romantic gesture was fizzling before it even left the ground. As I ended the call amid her sputtering protests and turned back to finish feeding Lily, humming a soft tune to recapture the lost piece of the afternoon, the sudden chime of the doorbell shattered the moment once more, pulling me toward the front door with Lily still in my arms, and through the peephole I caught sight of 2 familiar figures huddled on the porch under the fading light. Mom clutching her oversized roller suitcase like a lifeline and Tina beside her with that weary expression. That spoke volumes about the drive they'd clearly made straight from whatever airport debacle had unfolded, both of them staring at the door expectantly as if showing up uninvited could rewrite the rules I'd just enforced, leaving me to wonder just how far this confrontation was about to unravel right on my doorstep. Peering through the peephole at those 2 familiar yet unwelcome figures on my porch, Mom with her perfectly coiffed hair now slightly askew from the wind of their hurried drive and Tina slumping against the railing with that defeated posture she adopted whenever her schemes hit a wall. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions surging through me like a double espresso on an already tense day, the kind of mix where exasperation battles with a reluctant sense of duty because no matter how many times they'd pulled the stunt of showing up empty-handed expecting me to fix their messes, there was always that underlying thread of family loyalty tugging at me even as it frayed my nerves to the breaking point. Lily squirmed in my arms, her small hands clutching at my shirt as if sensing the shift in the air, and I took a deep breath before cracking the door open just wide enough to let a sliver of the porch light spill inside, positioning myself as a barrier between the cozy interior of my home and the impending invasion of their drama that had a way of sucking the oxygen out of any room they entered, my voice coming out firmer than I felt when I said, "What are you doing here, Mom? Tina? I thought you were halfway to the airport by now, because after that explosive phone call where I'd revealed the frozen funds and her cards were already bouncing like bad checks at a family reunion." Their presence on my doorstep in Dayton felt less like a surprise and more like the next inevitable chapter in this ongoing saga of entitlement and poor planning that had defined our relationships for far too long. Mom pushed forward immediately, her eyes flashing with that indignant fire she reserved for when the world didn't bend to her whims. Suitcase wheels rumbling over the wooden planks as she demanded entry with a tirade about how I'd sabotaged her dream escape to Paris, the city of lights and romance that she'd romanticized in her mind as the cure-all for the boredom and regrets piling up since Dad's death left her rattling around in that empty house in Cincinnati with nothing but daytime TV and her collection of unread travel magazines to fill the hours. Tina lingered a step behind, her gaze flicking past me to where Lily peeked curiously from behind my legs, and she chimed in with a softer, but no less manipulative plea, mentioning how the airline had denied boarding after the card declined, and now they were stranded without a plan, her words laced with that subtle guilt trip about family sticking together in tough times. The very same line she'd used to justify dipping into the account last year for what turned out to be a weekend getaway with some guy who vanished faster than the money. I held my ground, the door still only ajar as the evening chill seeped in, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain, explaining once more that the money was moved to protect Lily's needs, the endless stream of allergy tests, and that pricey hypoallergenic formula that kept her from breaking out in hives every other week, rather than fund Mom's fantasy of sipping wine on the Seine while the rest of us scraped by on tight budgets in the heartland where dreams like that stayed firmly in the movies. The standoff stretched on under the porch light that buzzed faintly overhead, Mom's arguments escalating from accusations of me being a controlling know-it-all to nostalgic pleas about how Dad would have wanted her to live a little, which had me stifling a bitter laugh because, if anything, Dad's frugal habits drilled into me from childhood were the reason I anticipated her moves this time around, his voice echoing in my head with warnings about foolish spending that sinks ships, a folksy saying he'd picked up from his factory days that now felt like prophecy in this ridiculous scene unfolding before me. To diffuse the tension without fully capitulating, because let's face it, letting them bulldoze inside would mean hours of wheedling and white lies until they wore me down, I stepped out fully onto the porch and closed the door behind me, suggesting they crash at the roadside motel a few miles down the interstate. The one with the vacancy sign that flickered like a bad omen and rooms that smelled perpetually of cigarette smoke despite the no-smoking policy. Pulling out my phone right there to book it on my dime as the magnanimous aunt and sister they painted me as in their narratives. As I tapped through the reservation, confirming 2 nights under Evelyn Jenkins with a queen bed and complimentary continental breakfast that was mostly stale bagels, I wove in my little act of retribution seamlessly. Dialing the bank's fraud hotline on a second line while pretending to check emails, reporting the suspicious activity on the joint cards in a hushed voice that detailed Mom's attempted international charges as potential identity theft, knowing full well it would lock down any remaining access they might have scraped together through back channels, and leave them high and dry when checkout time rolled around tomorrow. It was a clever jab, satisfying in its subtlety as I handed over the confirmation code with a sympathetic smile, watching Mom's relief mix with underlying suspicion while Tina muttered something about larger debts piling up from unexpected expenses that hinted at deeper troubles like the credit card max-outs she'd never mentioned before, her vague admission planting a seed of unease about just how entangled this web really was beyond the Paris pipe dream. With hugs that felt obligatory and promises to talk in the morning once they'd settled, I waved them off into the gathering dusk, their taillights disappearing down the quiet suburban street lined with maple trees shedding their autumn colors like confetti from a party long over, and retreated inside to the warmth of my home where Lily awaited with open arms, the simple act of tucking her in for the night a balm against the lingering adrenaline. But as I scrolled through my notifications later that evening, curled up on the couch with a cup of herbal tea steaming in my hands, my phone rang again with an unfamiliar area code, the caller ID displaying Local PD, Fraud Division. In stark letters that sent a jolt through me, the automated prompt on the other end requesting immediate callback regarding an alert on the family account that had escalated beyond what I'd anticipated, leaving me staring at the screen in the dim lamplight with my heart sinking at the realization that my protective measures might have just invited a whole new level of scrutiny into our already fractured lives. Staring at that incoming call from the fraud division of the local police department late into the evening, with the house finally settling into the quiet rhythm of night where only the distant hum of traffic on the interstate broke the silence and Lily's soft breathing echoed from the baby monitor on the coffee table, I felt a cold wave of regret wash over me for having poked the bear with my anonymous tip about the suspicious charges, because what I'd intended as a precise strike to hamstring Mom and Tina's ill-fated adventure was now spiraling into an official investigation that could drag my name through the mud right alongside theirs, exposing the intricate web of family finances I'd woven to keep Lily afloat amid the relentless tide of their poor choices that had eroded our shared resources like acid rain on a rusty roof. I let the voicemail play out in full, the detective's voice gravelly and matter-of-fact as he introduced himself as Harris and requested a callback to discuss Recent activity on the joint account, mentioning preliminary flags on international attempts that matched patterns of elder financial abuse. A phrase that hit too close to home since Mom was pushing 65 and her impulsivity bordered on the self-destructive in ways that made me question if I should have stepped in sooner rather than playing guardian angel from afar. After pacing the living room for what felt like an eternity, but was probably just 10 minutes of internal debate over whether to lawyer up or face it head-on, I dialed back with Lily's monitor clipped to my waistband like a lifeline. My voice steady as I confirmed my identity and agreed to come in first thing the next morning, all while my mind raced through scenarios where this could boomerang back on me for the preemptive transfer I'd made, the one that safeguarded the bulk of the funds, but now looked suspiciously like I'd orchestrated the whole shortfall to begin with. The drive to the station the following day unfolded under a slate-gray sky that mirrored my mood, rain pattering against the windshield in a steady drizzle that turned the streets into slick mirrors reflecting the weight of unspoken family secrets. And upon arrival, I was ushered into a cramped interview room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer ink, where Detective Harris waited with a stack of printouts and a demeanor that suggested he'd seen every variation of domestic financial drama but still needed to probe for the truth buried under layers of half-truths and omissions. He laid out the details methodically, showing me logs of the bounce charges at a Paris hotel reservation system and an airline booking that Mom had apparently pushed through in a last-ditch effort before my freeze took full effect. His questions zeroing in on the timeline of the account closure and whether I had knowledge of any co-conspirators, to which I responded with careful candor, admitting the family history of unauthorized withdrawals by Mom and Tina without volunteering the full extent of my involvement, because revealing my proactive move felt like handing him ammunition to paint me as the puppet master in this tangled mess rather than the protector I'd always aimed to be. As the conversation deepened, Harris dropped a bombshell that twisted the knife further, explaining how the secondary card linked to the account traced back to a man named Rick Harlan, a smooth operator from online dating circles whose real exploits included a trail of reported scams across Ohio and neighboring states, painting Mom's fiancé as less of a romantic savior and more of a leech who'd likely encouraged the Paris ploy to bleed the account dry before vanishing with his cut. A revelation that had me biting back a sardonic laugh at the irony of her chasing love in the City of Lights only to hook up with a con artist who probably saw her as just another mark in a long line of desperate hearts. The bureaucratic absurdity of it all provided a brief spark of humor amid the tension, like when Harris recounted how the hotel in Paris had already filed a preliminary complaint with Interpol over the declined deposit, turning what started as a family spat into an international incident that could involve extradition jokes if things escalated. And I found myself chuckling inwardly at the image of Mom haggling with French clerks in broken phrases from a travel app while her cards kept failing like a bad magic trick. Back home by early afternoon, with Lily's daycare pickup on my mind and the rain now a full downpour that matched the storm brewing inside me, Mom's voicemails piled up on my phone detailing their humiliating eviction from the motel after another declined payment and pleas for me to intervene with the police, since I was the account holder of record. Her voice cracking with a vulnerability that tugged at old heartstrings even as it fueled my resolve to let the consequences play out a bit longer. Faced with the dilemma of whether to shield them fully and risk enabling more chaos or dole out a measured dose of reality, I opted for the latter in a way that scratched my itch for clever retribution, firing off an anonymous email to Rick's last known contact from a disposable account I'd set up years ago for just such family firewalls, crafting the message to sound like an insider tip from Mom's inner circle warning him that the Paris fund was a setup by suspicious relatives monitoring every move and that she'd already confessed his involvement to authorities, phrasing it with enough juicy details about the police probe to spook him into ghosting her completely before they could rendezvous at the airport. It was a witty maneuver, one that left me with a grim sense of satisfaction as his social media activity went silent within hours, stranding Mom without her supposed white knight and forcing her to confront the folly of her choices in isolation. But the audience in my head, the rational part that weighed long-term fallout, whispered disapproval at how my withholding of key details from Harris might complicate Lily's custody if the investigation veered into custody disputes or asset freezes. A moral gray area where my revenge tasted sweet yet left a sour aftertaste of isolation from the very family ties I claimed to protect. As the day wound down and I prepared a simple dinner of mac and cheese for Lily, her laughter filling the kitchen like a temporary reprieve, my phone buzzed once more with a follow-up from Detective Harris. His text terse and pointed about a newly uncovered transfer I'd made to an offshore-linked savings account the day before the incident, requesting an urgent clarification on its purpose amid the ongoing fraud assessment, the words on the screen blurring slightly in the steam from the stove. As I realized my carefully laid plans were unraveling faster than I'd ever anticipated, pulling me deeper into a web of my own making that threatened to ensnare us all. The text from Detective Harris about that offshore-linked transfer lingered on my phone screen like an accusation etched in digital ink, pulling me out of the mundane rhythm of bedtime routines with Lily, where I'd been reading her that worn copy of Goodnight Moon for the umpteenth time. Her eyelids drooping as the words washed over us in the soft glow of the nightlight that cast whimsical shadows on the walls of her nursery, and suddenly the fragile sanctuary I'd built around these small moments felt vulnerable to the encroaching tide of revelations that could upend everything from custody arrangements to the very trust fund I'd maneuvered into place to shield her from the family's penchant for self-sabotage that had defined our lives since Dad's untimely exit left us navigating a minefield of grief and greed without his steady hand at the helm. I fired off a quick reply to Harris assuring him it was a standard diversification for Lily's long-term medical expenses, the kind of white lie wrapped in partial truth that bought me time but not at my conscience, because transparency in this family had always been a one-way street, with Mom and Tina extracting without explanation while I doled out portions like a reluctant banker guarding the vault against their endless withdrawals that chipped away at the principal meant for emergencies rather than escapades. The next morning brought a pounding at the door that jolted me from a fitful sleep haunted by dreams of courtroom dramas where I stood accused of hoarding family wealth, and there they were again, Mom and Tina, looking more disheveled than ever after their night in that subpar motel where the thin walls amplified every creak and cough from neighboring rooms. Mom's makeup smudged from what I suspected were frustrated tears and Tina carrying a takeout bag that smelled suspiciously like fast food. Breakfast as their peace offering or bribe to gain entry this time around. We settled uneasily at the kitchen table after I relented and let them in, Lily babbling happily from her playpen as a buffer against the tension that crackled in the air like static before a storm, and Mom launched into her plea with hands clasped dramatically, begging me to call off the police hounds because their simple misunderstanding had snowballed into a nightmare of frozen assets and judgmental stares from motel staff, who treated them like common thieves rather than the upstanding, if flawed, Jenkins women they'd always fancied themselves to be. As the conversation unfolded over cooling coffee that I poured more out of habit than hospitality, Tina's defensiveness cracked under the pressure, leading to a confession that peeled back layers of our shared history in a way that left me reeling. She admitted to siphoning funds from the account 2 years back not just for her own needs during a rough patch, but to cover Mom's mounting casino debts from those weekend benders in Atlantic City that she'd hidden from me under the guise of girls' trips. A betrayal that hit harder than the Paris fiasco, because it meant the very medical copays I'd scrimped to cover for Lily had been diverted to roulette wheels and slot machines in a cycle of enabling that painted our family portrait in shades of dysfunction I'd long suspected but never wanted confirmed. The moral dilemma twisted inside me like a knot I couldn't untie. On one side the pull to expose it all to Harris and let the chips fall where they may for the sake of justice and Lily's untainted future. And on the other the lingering loyalty to the women who'd raised me amid their own storms, Mom's eyes pleading for mercy as she spun tales of desperation born from loneliness after Dad's heart gave out on that factory floor, her voice breaking with details of how Rick's abandonment had left her exposed and broke in a foreign city where every declined card felt like a public shaming. Humor edged into my internal monologue despite the gravity, a wry observation that this Whole saga resembled one of those Lifetime movies where the plucky heroine outsmarts her scheming kin, but in reality, it was Messier with real stakes like Lily's next allergy shot hanging in the balance, if exposing them triggered asset seizures that froze everything indiscriminately. Faced with their raw vulnerability and my own itch for a reckoning that wouldn't destroy us outright, I chose a path of calculated kindness laced with payback. Excusing myself to the living room under the pretense of making a helpful call to the airline about reinstating their flights home from whatever limbo they'd landed in after the cancellations. But instead I dialed posing as a concerned relative of Evelyn Jenkins with urgent news of a family emergency back in Ohio that required immediate return, feeding the agent just enough fabricated details about a hospitalized kin to trigger a full refund and cancellation without alerting Mom or Tina directly, the satisfaction blooming as I overheard the confirmation beep that sealed their stranding a little longer in Parisian uncertainty, where they'd have to scrape by on wits and whatever euros they'd smuggled past customs. It was a clever twist, one that isolated them further from easy outs while giving me the upper hand in dictating the timeline of any reconciliation. Yet as I returned to the kitchen with feigned apologies about system errors, Tina's sharp gaze suggested she sensed the undercurrent, her quiet mutter about how my help always came with strings that made me question if this revenge was fortifying our bonds or fraying them beyond repair, especially since withholding the full truth from the police positioned me in a morally ambiguous spot where protecting Lily meant potentially sacrificing the slim chance of family unity. The visit dragged on into the afternoon with Lily's nap providing a brief interlude of peace, but as they gathered their things to head back to the motel, now extended on my card for one more night. To keep up appearances, the tension peaked when Tina's phone buzzed with a notification that drained the color from her face, her whisper to Mom about an incoming message from Mark, Lily's absentee father who'd vanished to Vegas years ago after one too many bar fights and bad bets, claiming he'd heard about the account drama through old contacts and was filing papers to contest his share of the inheritance. A bombshell that left them scrambling with promises to loot me in later while I masked my rising panic behind a nod of solidarity. Hours later, after tucking Lily in and staring at the ceiling in the dark, a knock echoed from the front door accompanied by the unmistakable rustle of an envelope being slipped through the mail slot. The thick packet landing with a thud on the entryway floor bearing the seal of a Cleveland law firm and the words urgent, contested estate matter stamped across the front in bold red letters that promised complications far beyond the Paris misadventure, drawing me inexorably toward a confrontation with shadows from the past that could redefine everything I'd fought to secure. Retrieving that thick envelope from the law firm in Cleveland from where it had landed unceremoniously on my entryway floor late into the night, with the house enveloped in the hush that follows a long day of emotional skirmishes and Lily's even breathing providing the only soundtrack from her room down the hall, I tore it open under the harsh beam of the porch light that spilled through the open door, the papers inside rustling like dry leaves in a gale as they revealed a formal petition from Mark, Tina's ex and Lily's biological father, asserting his claim to a substantial portion of Dad's estate under some convoluted interpretation of Ohio inheritance laws that he'd apparently lawyered up for from his current haunt in Las Vegas, where rumors swirled through family grapevines about his latest string of poker losses and shady side gigs that kept him perpetually one step ahead of bill collectors, but light years from responsible parenting. The document outlined how he'd been tipped off about the account turmoil by an anonymous source, likely Tina in a fit of vengeful spite after our last tense exchange, and was now leveraging it to demand an emergency hearing for asset division, arguing that the funds intended for Lily's care were marital property from his brief union with Tina that entitled him to half. A notion that ignited a fierce protectiveness in me because those dollars represented not just money, but the fragile barrier I'd erected against the very instability he'd embodied when he abandoned them both years ago after one too many nights at the tables turned into dawn raids on the fridge for quick cash. Sleep evaded me after that discovery, my mind churning through strategies as I paced the darkened living room with a mug of chamomile tea cooling untouched in my hands. Weighing the call to my own attorney Carla first thing in the morning against the temptation to confront Mom and Tina directly about Mark's resurgence, because while part of me relished the irony of their schemes boomeranging back in the form of this wild card from the past, the larger reality loomed that his involvement could freeze the entire trust I'd established for Lily's future. Those specialist visits and potential therapies for her allergies hanging in precarious balance if the courts got wind of our internal financial wrangling without the full context of who had truly safeguarded the pot amid their endless dipping. By dawn, after a fitful few hours where dreams blended courtroom battles with Paris street scenes of Mom haggling over hotel bills, I reached out to Carla, who confirmed the petition's legitimacy, but advised gathering ironclad proof of the fund's earmarked purpose through Dad's old will notations and my transaction logs. Her voice on the line carrying that no-nonsense efficiency that made me grateful for her expertise, even as she warned that transparency with the police might be the only way to neutralize Mark's play without collateral damage to my custody standing. The day escalated into a frenzy when Mom and Tina arrived unannounced once more, this time with the pallor of true desperation etched on their faces after scraping together enough for a budget flight to Paris on borrowed cards from distant relatives. Their stories spilling out in a torrent over hastily made sandwiches at the kitchen table where Lily played obliviously with her blocks, Mom admitting tearfully that the trip had been a desperate bid to meet Rick in a neutral spot away from U.S. authorities sniffing around his scams, but more damningly, that the emptied account was meant to cover gambling debts she'd accrued in his name to keep the illusion of their whirlwind romance afloat. A confession that wove the threads of betrayal tighter by revealing how Tina had facilitated wire transfers disguised as gifts that depleted the inheritance Dad had so carefully portioned for all of us with specific riders for Lily's needs in light of her health vulnerabilities. The growing conflict reached its zenith as I initiated a video call to their cramped Paris hotel room, the screen flickering to life with the opulent backdrop of velvet curtains and city views that mocked their predicament. Their faces haggard under the harsh ring light of Mom's phone as pleas turned to accusations, Tina railing about my manipulation starving them of deserved shares while Mom invoked Dad's memory in a voice hoarse from jet lag and regret, but I held steady, unveiling the full scope slowly through shared screen documents of the trust setup and Mark's petition, forcing them to confront how their actions had invited this external threat that could orphan Lily's security entirely if not for my interventions that now positioned me as both savior and gatekeeper in their eyes. Humor flickered in the absurdity of it all, like when Mom described the hotel manager's frosty demeanor over the declined room extension as French for "you're out of luck, darling," a light vulgarity in her folksy recounting that almost drew a reluctant smile from me amid the tension. But the impending revenge crystallized in that moment as I authorized Carla to execute the final legal maneuver, a court filing to reroute any accessible estate remnants directly into the irrevocable trust for Lily, effectively stranding Mom and Tina with a mounting hotel tab they couldn't touch while simultaneously wiring a modest sum for economy seats home with a pointed note attached reading "Last chance to land softly. Use it wisely." A clever loophole that provided escape without absolution, satisfying the deep-seated need for payback after years of their leeching, but laced with enough ambiguity to make me pause at the cost to my soul. As the call dissolved into stunned silence on their end and I powered down the device with Lily dozing against my shoulder, the uncertainty settled over me like a heavy quilt, reflections swirling on whether this triumph had fortified our fractured bonds or isolated me further in a fortress of self-reliance built on half measures and withheld truths, Mark's claim still lurking unresolved in the courts and Mom's resentment potentially festering into future vendettas, leaving me to ponder in the quiet hours if true victory meant reclaiming the money or merely delaying the next wave of family tempests that tested the limits of forgiveness and the price of protection.